Hello, everyone. While people are still joining, I am happy to start our April edition of the monthly Forest Restoration Talks, a webinar series that is hosted by the Superb Project and is also still supported by IUFRO. Today, we will talk about the evolution of forest restoration approaches in Europe and what we can learn from that. So it will also get quite practical, which is really nice, because in Superb, we have this knowledge base on the scientific investigations, but also on the practical experiences. And it's a very nice combination and very inspiring. So we will really look forward to that. I'm your moderator today, Gesche Schifferdecker, Communications Manager at EFI, and also the Communications Manager for Superb. And I would like to, before we start, I would like to introduce our two speakers for today. Our first speaker will be Maitane Erdozain Ibarra. She is working for the Forest Science and Technology Center of Catalonia. And she's a biologist specialized in forest ecology with several years of experience studying the impact of forest disturbances on biodiversity and also on the provision of ecosystem services. And currently her research in CTFC aims to gather and synthesize practical experiences from forest restoration, which she's going to introduce to us today, and also adaptation projects across Europe to serve as a learning opportunity for the future, basically. And then our second speaker for today is Katharina Lapin. She is the head of the Department of Forest, Biodiversity and Nature Conservation at the Federal Forest Research Center in Austria. She holds a PhD in landscape planning and landscape architecture from the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. And she has made contributions to forest biodiversity management, vegetation science, invasion biology, and also biodiversity conservation. And amongst other activities, she also contributes to the chapters of the IPBES report on invasive species. Next slide, please. Just to continue with the housekeeping rules before we kick off the presentations. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available to watch on the EFI YouTube account in the next couple of days. So in case you were really excited and you want to share it with your peers, then this would be super nice. You can share it. For questions to the panelists, we suggest to use the dedicated Q&A box. And we will listen to both presentations actually before we kick off with the questions. Only if you have something super urgent, then it can be asked after Maitane's presentation, but otherwise we will have a panel afterwards, and then you can already add your questions once they come to your mind to the Q&A box, and we will make sure to pick them up after the presentations. And then we always suggest you to follow us on LinkedIn, and more information you will follow, of course, also after the presentation. But now I'm happy to and really curious to learn more about the experiences from forest restoration in Europe. And without further ado, I hand over to Maitane.
Okay, thank you, Gesche, for the lovely introduction. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. So as mentioned, my name is Maitane Erdozain, and I work at the Science and Technology Center of Catalonia in Spain. And today I'm really happy to share with you some of the key lessons we have learned after analyzing the evolution of forest restoration in Europe based on knowledge extracted from experts. So let me jump right into the presentation. And as you all know, we are currently living a very exciting moment for forest restoration. There is a global wave of interest with big international and European goals and initiatives supporting restoration efforts. But it's important to remember that forest restoration has a long and rich history. So for example, there are accounts of the creation of a forest service to restore some degraded land dating back to as far as 2000 years ago in China. And there are also accounts of restoration in Europe taking place in the Middle Ages. So this long journey gives us an opportunity, right? An opportunity to learn from what has been done before. The problem is that these lessons haven't always been well documented and shared, which means that valuable knowledge can easily be lost. So that's exactly the gap that we wanted to help fill with this work. And our main goal, therefore, was to understand how forest restoration has evolved over time in Europe and what for. Well, we wanted to first see why and how things have changed. So what the main drivers of change have been, whether ecological, social, political, technical, economic factors. And second, we wanted to learn from both the challenges and successes of the past so that we can extract meaningful lessons that help guide our current and future efforts. And how did we do this? Well, we collaborated with 32 national experts from 18 different countries across Europe who developed some detailed national narratives about the history of forest restoration in their country. And to ensure some consistency, we provided a pre-designed template with different sections and a total of 37 indicators that they had to develop. Once all the narratives were collected, we carried out a systematic thematic analysis, looking across all the texts to identify what were the recurring patterns, what were the differences, and key insights in general. Based on this comparative analysis, we identified 3 key historical periods that help us understand better this evolution. The first one is what we call the disaster risk reduction period. This is the one that comes before 1940. And it was largely driven by this aim to reduce disasters such as floods or avalanches. Then in the 1940s and until the 1990s, we entered the second period, the production focus period, where the main goal was to increase timber supply. And finally, from the 1990 onwards, we see a shift towards a multifunctionality period where restoration began to address a wider range of goals, such as economic, but also social and ecological goals. So for each of these 3 periods, we looked at different themes or aspects of restoration, such as the species use, the governance, how the governance worked during that period, what defined success, what the main challenges were. And from this exercise, what did we find out? Well, this is a table summarizing all the findings, but I know it's overwhelming and quite boring. So right now I would try to walk you through this table with lots of pictures so that we can see how these different aspects, the different columns, have been changing across the 3 different historical periods. I will not have time to go into much detail today, but I wanted to let you know that all the details and country level examples have been recently published in an article in Current Forestry Reports. So if you are interested in delving deeper, here you can have more information. All right, so let's start with the first restoration period, the risk reduction period. During this period, the main drivers of degradation that restoration efforts were trying to tackle were overgrazing, overharvesting, and erosion. And you can see the impact of these drivers of degradation in this graph. The dark green bars show the percentage of forest cover back then in the 19th or 20th centuries. And then in the lighter bars, you can see for comparison what the forest cover looks like today. And as you can see, for several countries, the forest cover had fallen to alarmingly low levels. And that wasn't just an environmental problem, it had also quite dramatic consequences for people in the form of floods, avalanches, moving dunes or sands. And on top of that, there was also increasing pressure from the expanding industries that needed wood. And this added another incentive for many countries to start afforesting. So naturally, given all these challenges, the main goals of restoration during this period were reducing disaster risk to prevent floods, avalanches, and so on. Also protecting soils from erosion and producing timber. So in short, we can say that restoration at this stage was very much about stabilizing the landscape, protecting people, and meeting timber demands. And to achieve these goals, the main restoration strategy used during this period was afforestation. In other words, planting trees in places where there hadn't been forests before. So for example, in deforested mountain slopes, in heathlands, in the karst area, or plains of sandy soils. And regarding the most common activities, restoration activities during this period, it was a combination. The first was introducing prohibitions. So for example, limiting things like forest grazing, litter raking, or over-harvesting. And there are already accounts as early as in 1775, for example, in the Croatian Forestry Ordinance, that these prohibitions were introduced. But because many areas were so heavily degraded during this period, active restoration was often needed. So planting and sowing trees, preparing soils intensively, like you can see in this photo, draining wet areas before planting, or fencing to protect young trees from grazing were very common during this period. In terms of the species that were used, fast-growing pioneer species were the go-to choice, which reflects the level of degradation, as well as the urgency, right, to get the forest back quickly. Pines were particularly popular, but Norway spruce was also widely used. So for example, in this graph from Germany, you can see that around 1890, more than 80% of the trees that were planted were conifers, with the proportion of spruce and fir that was planted increasing over time, and the proportion of beech decreasing. And next, an interesting exception to this conifer dominance was found in the sandy soils of Hungary and Romania, where the non-native black locust was widely planted during this period. In terms of governance, most afforestation efforts during this early period were promoted and funded by the state. But since much of the land wasn't owned by the state, governments had to either convince private owners to afforest or acquire the land themselves, which proved to be a very costly and slow process. Also during this period, a key to the success was the creation of these dedicated administrative units that led the work and provided also technical support. Like for example, the reforestation commissions in Spain that were created in 1888, or the karst afforestation commissions created in 1881. All these efforts resulted in forest cover increasing overall. For example, in this graph, you can see the forest cover in Denmark, how it doubled from around 4% in 1810 to over 8% by 1931. This growing forest cover, of course, helped reduce erosion problems, also provided timber for the expanding industries, Still, in many cases, the targets that were marked were not fully met because at the same time, in parallel, deforestation for agriculture continued to happen. Another positive impact was job creation. As you can see in this picture from the Slovenian karst afforestation in 1895, many hands were needed for these large-scale afforestation campaigns. However, the established forests were mostly even-aged plantations of a single species, sometimes even invasive species. So they tended to be quite low in terms of diversity and sometimes replace more biodiverse habitats. So ecologically speaking, and based on our current standards, we can say that it was not that successful. And this period was not free of challenges. The main challenge was that of conflicting goals and local opposition because neighbors lost their access or the rights to the communal use of forest resources. And then other challenges also include continued grazing, limited knowledge, insufficient funding, political instability, especially by the end of the period, and also a lack of management post-planting. And this brings us to the second period, which was marked by geopolitical crisis as well as changes in the wood market, which in turn shifted the focus of forest restoration even more towards timber production. So the world wars were a clear driver of degradation during this period, not only through direct destruction during fighting, but also and mostly due to the overharvesting that happened to meet military needs on the one hand, but also to reconstruct the countries after the war. Also, deforestation for agriculture was quite exacerbated due to the wars, like the poor socioeconomic conditions post-war. And all of this can be seen or is reflected in these graphs that show the changes in forest cover in different countries. And as you can see, in some of them, there is a clear decrease around 1940s, so coinciding with the wars. Additionally, timber became very important for the economic growth and flourishing industries post-war. So all of this resulted in a renewed interest in forest restoration for timber production across most of the countries we studied. But reducing disaster risks also continued to be a key priority. At the same time, the difficult socioeconomic conditions in rural areas at this time made job creation quite an important driver for large-scale reforestation efforts in some of the countries we studied. So to achieve these goals, large-scale afforestation and reforestation, often conducted in abandoned farmland, grasslands, peat bogs, but also in unproductive forests, became the dominant form of restoration. And later on, as other ecosystem services like recreation gained importance, the designation of protected areas also emerged as a key form of passive restoration. Planting was the main activity during this period, often accompanied by intensive soil preparation. And unlike in the previous period, this period, the preparation began to be mechanized, as you can see in this photo. In terms of species, again, conifers remain the main protagonists, particularly pine and spruce, which were often planted outside their natural range. This conifer dominance is clearly visible in these two graphs. On the left, in blue, you can see that over 80% of the trees planted in Spain during this period were conifers, and a similar story is also seen on the right graph, which is the trees that were planted in France during this period. So among broadleaves, poplar and black locust continue to be popular productive species, but other species such as beech and oak were used as well, although much less, and in exceptional cases, for example, in the karst afforestation or in enrichment plantations, but more by the end of the period. Some countries also reported some animal reintroductions to help in forest restoration, such as lynx and beaver introductions. As in the previous period, in terms of governance, forest restoration took place on both public and private lands. But what really marks the difference in this second period is the widespread nationalization of private forests, especially in countries like Romania, Croatia, Slovenia, Hungary, and Poland. And also a move towards a more strong and centralized state control of forest management, which was seen in these countries, but also in other countries such as Spain, Italy, or Greece. Public funding for these large-scale initiatives often came from timber sales, with France's National Forestry Fund or Slovenia's biological depreciation being like key examples of this. And in countries where forests remain mostly private, the high timber demand and price of this period motivated owners to reforest or afforest their land themselves. This centralized management made it possible to achieve large-scale afforestation and reforestation goals, leading to an increase in forest cover and timber stocks. So, for instance, as shown in the graph on the left, countries like Romania and Slovenia reforested or afforested over 10% of their country during this period, and other countries also had significant gains. These efforts helped reduce erosion-related problems, and job creation was also quite successful. However, these socioeconomic achievements came at an ecological cost. Many of the plantations led to environmental degradation and low resilience, but there are also exceptions, like this is a generalization. But what is true is also that the period saw a major shift in Europe's tree composition, with conifers becoming much more dominant. So, for example, in the UK, in the graph on the right of your screens, you can see with the black line how the proportion of conifers increased from 41 in 1947 to 67% by 1965. So in less than 20 years, there was a major increase in the share of conifers in the country. The main challenges during this second period were once again conflicting goals, mostly between agriculture and forest restoration, but also between forestry and nature conservation. And then other key issues include also browsing, biungulates, limited stakeholder involvement, and a lack of follow-up management after planting. And all these challenges bring us to the third and last period, the multifunctionality focus period. Here, the main causes of degradation began to shift. And interestingly, many were actually derived from the restoration practices of the previous period. So excessive homogeneity of the forests raised concerns. And at the same time, the growing impacts of climate change were becoming more and more evident. So together, these two factors led to an increase in the intensity and frequency of natural disturbances, such as droughts, wildfires, wind throws, or pests. At the same time, society began to show greater environmental awareness, with new demands emerging, such as recreation, and also a growing influence of international and European environmental policies. And a drop also in the timber prices during this time played a key role. So taking all of this together, we can see that there was a major shift in the restoration goals during this period. So biodiversity conservation, tourism and recreation, and climate change mitigation and adaptation became key motivations for restoration from the 1990s on. But yeah, still the earlier goals of timber production and disaster risk reduction remain important. To meet these evolving goals, segregative approaches, so for example, the designation of protected areas, continue to be important, but also more integrative strategies such as close to nature management or diversification of plantations became increasingly important. And also as natural disturbances grew more like frequent and intense, restoration efforts following these events became also increasingly common. There was also a diversification in terms of the activities that were conducted during restoration. So traditional methods like prohibitions, planting, fencing remain common, but new approaches started to gain traction. So especially the ones that were aiming at an increase in biodiversity. So this would include, for example, old growth forest management techniques such as gilding, as shown in the photo, and the protection of habitat trees or the emulation of natural disturbances such as prescribed burns. In terms of species, there was also a diversification. Pines, spruce, and black locust remain popular choices, but there was also a growing use of native deciduous trees, such as oaks and riparian species, also bushes. So for example, in Hungary, you can see in yellow how the area planted with hardwood species increased significantly between 1991 and 2010. And in terms of governance, there was also a diversification of the actors involved in restoration. So first of all, many of the forests that had been nationalized in the previous period were reprivatized. And also governance was increasingly decentralized to regional and local administrations across several countries. On top of that, new actors such as academia or NGOs became increasingly influential. And most importantly, a major new player entered the scene, the European Union, which not only influenced national policies, but also became a key source of funding for restoration initiatives. In terms of success, this period has seen improvements in several indicators of good ecological condition. For example, deadwood volumes have increased. In Switzerland, you can see on the left graph how there has been a clear increase between the 1980s and 2010s. There has also been an upward trend in the share of deciduous tree species across many countries. For example, in Germany, on the graph on the right, you can see how beech and other broadleaf species, which are shown in orange, increased from 25% to 34% between 1990 and 2012, while spruce and other conifers shown in blue have declined. Forest area did expand in some countries, but much less than in the previous periods, and often actually as a result of rural abandonment. And in several cases, it was reported that national forest expansion targets were not fully met. And why is that? Well, again, mostly the main obstacle during this period has been insufficient funding, also conflicting goals and browsing pressure. So these ones are similar to the obstacles we saw in the previous periods, but additionally, there have been new challenges emerging, namely climate change and increasingly frequent natural disturbances, becoming major concerns for restoration. Okay, so that was a quick overview of the three periods and how restoration has evolved. So now the question is, like, what can we take away from this so that we avoid repeating some of the same mistakes? Well, first of all, we can see that natural disasters trigger change. So as we have just seen, both the first and the third periods began in response to major natural disasters or environmental crises. This shows us how powerful these events can be in driving action. Ideally, we would try to prevent these disasters based on good ecological understanding of the system, solid monitoring, and of course, the political will to act on the evidence. But when this is not possible, at least we should seize the opportunity to implement change when these disasters do occur, like after major floods. Throughout Europe's history, geopolitical conflicts have had also a strong and an ambivalent influence on forest restoration. On the one hand, they have been clear drivers of degradation, as we have seen, but they have not only drivers of degradation, they are also obstacles. So they tend to disrupt ongoing restoration efforts because all of a sudden national priorities shift. But on the other hand, it is also true that these crises have triggered large-scale afforestation and reforestation campaigns over Europe, driven by mostly the need to ensure domestic timber supplies and strengthen self-sufficiency. So considering the very tumultuous current geopolitical situation, it is definitely important to keep these lessons in mind. Changes in forest ownership and governance can accelerate or slow down restoration. So throughout history, we've seen that periods of centralized forest management often lead to greater efficiency in achieving large-scale restoration goals. In contrast, privatization and fragmented ownership tend to make these initiatives more challenging to implement. And that is why governments over time have tried different mechanisms to overcome these obstacles, so ranging from expropriation to purchase, contracts, subsidies, tax incentives, and so on. But each of these tools come with its own limitations, so this is why property fragmentation continues to be a key challenge in forest restoration today. Funding has always been a bottleneck. A constant obstacle over the past 150 years has been insufficient funding. This analysis shows that the most successful large-scale initiatives were backed by solid long-term funding mechanisms, often based on the revenues from forest products, as we have seen during the second period. In recent decades, as we said, EU funding has played a key role in shifting restoration objectives and approaches in some countries, but despite this support, lack of funding continues to be a persistent challenge. So that is why we think that there is an urgent need to explore and implement new innovative financing mechanisms and sources to support restoration at scale. Markets and macroeconomics shape restoration. So the type of restoration promoted or financed is closely related to the change in demand and value of forest products and services. So for example, we saw how the rise of fossil fuels reduced the demand for fuel wood. At the same time, the booming mining industry increased the demands for timber, and altogether this led to a widespread conversion of coppice forests into tall conifer stands across many European countries. So these and other examples show us that it is important to relate or to link restoration with marketable benefits to motivate landowners and ensure also the long-term commitment and financing of restoration. Societal changes matter. Rural abandonment is a clear example of how socio-demographic shifts impact restoration. In some regions, rural abandonment has eased or alleviated the land use conflicts, and this has made restoration easier. But in others, especially in the Mediterranean context, it has led to unmanaged, like very dense forests with high fire risk. At the same time, growing environmental awareness of society has helped push for a better and more ambitious restoration. And again, these and other examples show us that it is crucial, or how crucial education is, as well as active stakeholder engagement, and of course, a strong and vibrant rural community as well. Policies. So by analyzing these 18 country narratives, we created these timelines you can see on the slide, where we have sorted all the policies that were mentioned as influential for forest restoration. And these include policies from different sectors, not only forestry, but also biodiversity, agriculture, water protection, and so on, as well as different types of policies. And what stands out from this analysis is that some of the most successful and impactful policies have been strong national laws that manage to balance ecological protection with socioeconomic benefits. Something worth keeping in mind now that the member states are starting to implement the nature restoration law. Also, the establishment of administrative units that were specialized in restoration, like the afforestation commissions that we mentioned during the first period, have been quite crucial in facilitating large-scale efforts. And finally, in recent decades, also ambitious international and European environmental policies have clearly played a major role in shaping forest restoration objectives and approaches. It is also important to recognize that the drivers of change do not act in isolation. In most cases, it is the combination of different types of factors, so social, environmental, economic, political factors that come together in a specific time and space to really trigger an impactful change. So, for example, as we said, for the beginning of the third period, it was not only environmental disasters, but it was also changes in policy and decrease in timber prices, increased social demand for some services that push for a real change in restoration approaches and objectives. So this highlights how deeply interconnected these dimensions are in the context of forest restoration, and why addressing them in an integrated way is essential for long-term success. And as you have seen throughout the overview of the three periods, conflicting goals have consistently been one of the biggest challenges to the success of forest restoration. These conflicts happen both at the socioeconomic level, so between different stakeholder groups, and also at the political level, so between different policy sectors. So some of the most recurrent tensions have been between agriculture and forestry, especially when both compete for land and subsidies. But there is also another long-standing conflict that has been between timber production and biodiversity conservation. And in more recent decades, new tensions have also emerged, such as between biodiversity goals and energy production and climate change mitigation. So we think that all of this shows that there is a need for a landscape level and holistic approach so that we can try to minimize the trade-offs between different land uses and objectives. And finally, in the narratives, we have seen a pattern that was repeated in several countries. So normally the solutions to a problem tend to be short-term, and often this means that they become the problems or the causes of degradation of future initiatives. In addition, the objectives evolve with the socioeconomic situation, the ecological context. So that means that the solutions of the past maybe are no longer perceived as such in the future. So examples of these trends would be, for example, the fixation of sandy soils with invasive exotic species, or the afforestation and reforestation with monocultures that have resulted in greater vulnerability to natural disturbances and are the object of restoration nowadays. Therefore, we end by suggesting that long-term thinking that is aware of the interconnectedness of the system is key for successful restoration. So here now you have the 10 lessons summarized into an infographic, and I believe they are very well summarized into this quote by Donella Meadows, who says that some problems consistently resist solution, and these are the problems for which a new way of looking is required. So yeah, thank you all for your attention. And also I wanted to especially thank all the national experts who provided valuable knowledge and made this work possible. And now with this, I will pass the floor to Katharina Lapin, who will go deeper into some of these lessons learned and see how they relate to the current challenges we face in forest restoration. So Katharina, over to you.
Thank you very much. But first, back to the moderator.
Thank you very much. Well, I can only say I'm very impressed. I mean, I was aware of the comprehensiveness of the knowledge that that was collected, but also the way you summarize it was very, very convincing, and I think also helpful for some of the practitioners that are joining this call. I'm a historian by training, so of course also this was kind of going back to my roots and really digging into the historical knowledge, including all the amazing photos and illustrations that you used, and that also showed, of course, that some issues we've been facing since a long time, and they come back if we look for short-term solutions. So I think that was very, very obvious, and that we will also use that, of course, when we develop further recommendation for policymakers, etc. Just to kind of emphasize also the fact that you stressed around the funding is another issue that I think we will try to tackle also with further superb outcomes, because the long-term funding is a crucial problem, and it also refers to the nature of the forest, because the forest is something that cannot be thought short-term because it takes so long to grow. Also in the end, the kind of looking at it from the different perspective shows that not just the forest is an ecosystem, but that everything that is surrounded, everyone, all the different disciplines, all the different areas that are involved in the forest are also own ecosystem that has to be considered in like from all those perspectives. And if we look at it only from one dimension, actually, we will lose the bigger picture, and we will have trade-offs when it comes to other dimensions. So thank you very much for that. We also already have a question.
Thank you.
We also already have a question in the Q&A, but I think that can be perfectly picked up in the panel discussion later. So I suggest that we continue with Katharina now, and then I'm really excited to learn even more, and then we can pick up some questions in the
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I hope you can see the right screen. Is this right?
Yes, these boots are made for walking. Yeah.
Perfect. And thank you for the introduction and this fantastic presentation. I tried to catch up on the time. Maitane already finished with the 10 lessons. And what we did also in this work package within the project is to look into the more practical knowledge out there on forest restorations, which has been developed in the last few decades. So I have a different time scale to present now, which was linked to two major subtasks in this work package. I'm just checking if I can. Okay. So why is this so relevant and more relevant than we have thought when we were in the beginning of the project is, of course, because of the regulation on nature restoration, where we have the obligation, the member states have the obligation to set restoration targets first within Natura 2000 areas, and then also in other areas according to the Article 4, especially where habitats like key target habitats have to be restored into a very good or in a good condition. So having this in mind and knowing that the regulation is not just is legally binding, it's worth maybe taking a more closer look where we need this practical knowledge on forest restoration. And you see very different types of restoration measures needed within the regulation. So we have I hope you can see the exactly. So we have measures where we which should aim to improve the condition of a target area, or restoration measures that should establish the habitats where they do not occur yet, and we have measures that target the habitat quality and quantity of habitats for the species listed under the Habitat Directive. And then we have additionally those measures that target Article 12. This is there where we have those indicators to improve the overall biodiversity status in forest ecosystems. So you see there is, even in one piece of legislation, quite a large set of restoration measures needed, which cover, I think, this very well known continuum of ecological restoration approaches, from reducing impacts to fully recovered ecosystems. And here we were interested in talking with those people who actually are responsible for most restoration activities across Europe, and to identify those projects. Before I jump into the results, I'd like to draw your attention to a scheme where, again, it's important which I found quite useful, to put again the importance to those measures, for example, in restoring connectivity, where those measures need to be very carefully selected and re-evaluated with the strategies and the targets. So the idea here is that before you even start the approach is to be very clear on the objectives, to re-evaluate this, and to re-evaluate or to assess the measures, the restoration methods in place to achieve those targets. Why is this so important? Basically, this is something that we learned from the practitioners also, that the restoration methods really are key when setting your goals, and that should be a straightforward process. So what was the output, or the way how we wanted to approach? How do we want to get to know all this knowledge out there on restoration projects? We organized local workshops and designed a short follow-up survey, and then also built a database on 700 EU-funded projects and 1,000 local projects. And hopefully those outputs, I mean, we are currently in the stage that we have analyzed some of them I'm going to present, and maybe this might lead into a bigger tool, like maybe an interactive tool within the gateway. So just to give you the background, the methodological one, and now I'd like to focus first on the approach and the questions we were looking to be answered by the practitioners. So in these 7 workshops, we had the aim to really identify those challenges, the motivations of the practitioners, people who have very different backgrounds, but have one thing in common, which is they are practically involved in the implementation of a restoration initiative, or many of them within their country. And they were able to give us quite a nice, I have to say, quite deep insights into their challenges. And of course, we also talked about those best practice examples. But here are the countries where we conducted the workshops. In these countries, we used a similar approach to identify the advances, the technical approaches, so that we have really a methodology that we could apply in different countries, always offering the possibility to discuss everything in the local languages, and the participants then had the chance to participate in a follow-up survey. So basically then this survey here, as you just see, was giving us had a general section and a specific country level section, where we were trying to get more very detailed project-specific information that we then could also lead into our database. So let's have a quick overlook, an overview on the answers. Interesting, we're across those countries in the last 10 years, and they have evaluated biotic threats as, let's say, the most important causes for degradation that call for forest restoration initiatives like pests and diseases, invasive species. So we have here but also in the middle, so from everything leading to tree mortality. I have to say that sometimes it was not easy to distinguish for them or to rate them. We have also asked the practitioners about, so why are they doing this job? What is their motivation to engage in forest restorations? And there was that's a summary of more complex questions, but in general we can say that the seeking for stability was one of the major driver, to support ecological processes. Gaining knowledge, many of them have a scientific background, and then number 3 was the feeling for many of the practitioners just simply feel responsible because they are skilled to make a change, and really also to then perform and to change ecosystem developments. So that's a quite exhausting table, but just showing you that we had the topics that came up in this open discussion points within across the 7 countries, the advances, the challenges, and the perspectives. And so, of course, it has limitations because this was just one group of practitioners we could reach for a country, but still that helped us to identify the environmental factors. Unsurprisingly, the bark beetle outbreaks were one of the major topics in Austria and in Germany. Law and regulation, funding was a topic everywhere and always. And there was quite a confidence around planning and technical aspects, and science and knowledge. They felt well supported. Here we have some drawn from those results. We can draw some implications for practice. So here again, practitioners are driven by some kind of commitments to future and to this wish to increase knowledge. And we have discussed, maybe I just prioritize one thing, is the monitoring and the long-term assessment of interventions. And what might help is to highlight the socioeconomic benefits of restoration initiative, which then hopefully leads again to the increase of funding possibilities. So this was the results from the practitioners we met in the last 2 years. It was a quite intense travel year, but now I'd like to draw your attention to the collection of EU-funded projects and local projects. And I have to thank Johanna Hoffmann. She's also working at the BFW and was mainly responsible for this task. And for collecting all these restoration projects, one thing that was super essential from the beginning, it was that in each country it was super essential to first identify the important stakeholder groups in order to find the networks, the databases, the organization and people that actually then helped us to collect those countries where we have the basic information covered. And for some, we have already made like a more extensive extraction of the data information. So you see how all the stakeholder groups are linked to each other. And that led us then into certain steps. We have divided it in 2 different workflows, one for the EU-funded projects and the national projects, because here we clearly have a very different baseline for the availability of the information. So after identifying the databases and the keyword search, and then with manually selection and some cleaning loops, we can conduct a project list that today contains 670 EU-funded projects. And then, of course, the approach for the more local projects, here again, there was always this manual collecting process that was quite time consuming. And we then also identified a lot of networks within this process that were quite helpful. So I'd like to draw your attention towards those platforms that helped us to identify those projects, because apparently Europe is full of platforms collecting projects, but for very different targets. And I hope I don't bomb the time now. I try to go be quick. We could identify 4 different types of data platforms. So there is this transnational databases covering really a global set, the very targeted EU or regional databases. A lot of national databases exist with very different approaches and very different level of detail. And then there is also some maybe not geographically linked databases from NGOs and voluntary initiatives. Here are some examples from the transnational databases. So some of them are well known from the FAO, from the Society of Ecological Restoration, and so on, where you can look up some major projects. A very good national database was the GoPro 4 database, where we have quite a successful link on all the projects funded by the LIFE program. And then we have a lot of national small databases in the local languages, partly, for example, the Bergwald project, which is also used to link volunteers with restoration activities and so on. And we have more of these voluntary initiatives that can be very, very small scale. We have, so here again, the problem is that there is no, there's kind of no, the information is very scattered across very different knowledge tools, but we have covered all countries in Europe, so not just European Union, and could then give, I think, a quite nice overview of projects. So once again, here is the country map. In some countries, it was simply easier than in others to identify those projects because of language barriers and sometimes of simply not existing documentations. Here is the map of the 689 EU-funded projects, mainly funded by the LIFE program, the European Development Fund, and Interreg. And then we have those 908 local, we call it local projects, but sometimes they are also quite transnational and covering several countries, which are now currently included in the database. Okay, so you see here the number of projects looking at the start year of each restoration project. Increased over time. That has, of course, to do with that many of the national, or let's say local projects, they they are very, very professional on their communication strategies. And so their representation online is often stronger, or they're easier to find than maybe some other projects which have a much bigger impact in the area restored. And you might notice that the EU-funded projects, they make like this, this loops, which is linked to funding periods of the LIFE program. Yeah. Also, this is quite nicely reflected in the number of restoration initiatives. The duration is, we have very few outliers, but mainly they are between 3 and 5 years from the feedback from the workshop participants, the practitioners on the ground, they all highly criticized this short-term funding opportunity, and especially for the monitoring, the long-term monitoring, and this unsecure, unstable, let's say, situation they're in. And it's kind of reflected also in the duration of the projects we have collected. And maybe misleading figure is here, shown in the next slide. And the number of total projects within the top 10 EU-funded countries. It looks at the first sight that Belgium would have received the largest share on funding on restoration initiatives. But that's basically not so much the case. It's more the case that many EU-funded projects are transnational, but there is usually a lead partner from Belgium who applied for the entire funding. And in the documentation, it's always not easy to separate the share of the funding across transnational activities. And there was a second reason, which I forgot now, but basically, this information is also available, but needs to be interpreted very carefully. Then at the top 10 locally and nationally funded countries for forest restoration, we see that Greece and Italy and Germany are the top 3. In Greece, it's mainly also for projects on wildfire prevention. So also here we have clear separations by topics. The objectives in general, the objectives are very diverse of the projects. We started to categorize them, and let's say top 5 objectives are usually capacity building, so not so much the really implementation on the ground, but also the increase of resilience here in gray was one of the major objectives. And then followed by the water quality, increasing species populations, and maintaining biodiversity. So we try to link it to the indicators which were published also within the working group, the success indicators here too. But first of all, let me also say that many objectives are, especially in the local restoration initiatives, many projects have several objectives. And it's really hard from the documentation that exists to elaborate let's say, the effectiveness or how these objectives have been reached. It is somehow better documented in the EU programs, but I think it lies in the nature of a project manager that he does not really want to share also the negative results, which I totally understand. But what's maybe easier to answer with this database is the forest restoration methods used to control pests and diseases were on the top list of common methods, followed by planning and stakeholder engagement. So here we see what was actually funded. I'm jumping a little bit because I don't want to take too much of your time. We can see a differentiation between passive restoration approaches and active restoration approaches and everything in between. That is somehow linked also to degradation intensity. A passive approach is mostly chosen when you have a more lower or a moderate degradation level, while an active one from moderate to high degradation. So we are still in the process of analyzing this data because it needs to be classified and it's a lot of manual work. But as you can see here, we still have 885 projects unclassified, for example, in the typology on let's say, restoration approaches. The same for the methods used, right? And you can see that the database contains mostly projects in the active restoration, with active restoration initiatives, less maybe passive protection of sites and so on. So to conclude with, there is a list. I even had to play around with the summary to make all the limitations fit on one page. But still, it's an incomplete data set, of course. We had to find a way to cover Europe, but not extensively. Also, the availability is not of the project, and the mismatch sometimes between the terminologies and the translations are existing. So that's quite challenging with all the AI tools existing. It's sometimes still challenging to really find the right objectives and to classify it. And also, maybe not all ecoregions or forest types are represented here. Also, this can be, of course, improved. But I think it's absolutely important to have a comprehensive database because, as I showed before, there is so much more restoration going on. And documentation is kind of key for the learning process for future restoration initiatives, and to make the funding more targeted and efficient. I'll not go into more details because I think I am already far beyond the time I was given. So just finally, there was also some positive things with the practitioners, some positive feedback, and this was, of course, the scientific research behind restoration was mentioned very often, and project like Superb gave the practitioners again some motivation to keep growing, to keep developing tools and so on, to collaborate and to develop new projects and new initiatives. We have summarized most of the results in this milestone and deliverable reports. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katharina. Just adding also a spotlight to Maitane. Now we will start with the panel discussion. And just as a general feedback, I think it's really impressive work that you did to set up these workshops, these diverse workshops with the practitioners. I found also the motivations for forest restoration quite interesting. Some were to be expected. Others, like spirituality, were surprising. And it's also great because obviously people who work with forests also look for a kind of deeper meaning of their work. So they are more intrinsically motivated, which I can definitely confirm for everyone working in Superb. So that was interesting, and just kind of a curiosity. Regarding the comprehensive project collection that you prepared, or that Johanna prepared, I think it's great to see the big increase of national funding for forest restoration projects. So that was also something that really caught my attention. I have some general questions, and I only see one question in the chat. So I want to encourage the people joining also to add your questions to the Q&A in case you have any. So I would start with a more kind of general question before we go into the question in the chat, which links to the NRR, the Nature Restoration Regulation, that you also mentioned in the beginning of your presentation, Katharina. And that, of course, is a bit of the elephant in the room right now, because throughout the progress of the Superb project, the negotiations took place, and then a quite adapted nature restoration law, now called regulation, was then accepted. So I wonder what chances do you see with the new NRR? And this question goes to both of you, in terms of the lessons learned that you collected from the past. Do you think that, certainly the knowledge that both of you collected is going to be useful, but do you think the NRR can actually pick up, or do you think the member states will be able to pick up these lessons learned? Because you've also looked into the NRR and the different articles. And what opportunities do you see there also in terms of, for instance, better chances for long-term monitoring? You mentioned this as a lacking point, or in terms of stakeholder engagement. So maybe just a kind of a more of a general review from your perspective.
Should I answer, or do you want to start, Maitane?
You can start, Katharina.
All right.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I see. So I think one lesson learned is definitely this diversity of methods and approaches that is needed to have those very different restoration or degradation needs across Europe. That we have very different challenges to tackle. Some of them are very common, as we have seen also in the historic preview. But I think when you go to the site, some challenges need probably a mix and a diversity of methods and approaches. And regarding the nature restoration law or nature restoration regulation, I think here it will be somehow key to respect also those national differences again. Although we have a joint target to solve, and also within the nature restoration regulation, there is always a reference to already existing instruments in protection and in biodiversity protection, conservation, and some unresolved topics where I think we have the answers in the practical knowledge already out there. Yeah, for example, so one example could be that that any restoration within the sooner time frame should refer to the goods to the reference areas in good conditions, and here I think we should try to be as science-based as possible, as knowledge-based as possible, to define those reference or good reference areas in good conditions, for example. But that's just one example.
Thank you very much. Maitane, do you want to compliment?
Yeah, I agree with what Katharina said, and based on the historical, like, I agree that each country has its own challenges and therefore some flexibility in the adoption of this European level legislation or regulation is definitely required. But I think it's also so interesting to look at the shared challenges, and that maybe in this regulation they are not addressed. For example, insufficient or funding, right? Like the question is like where should the funds come to restore all the land that is supposed to be restored. So in that sense, I think like there should be some more emphasis on how do we get the funds. And I think based on the history, like it's important to actually value the ecosystem services that we are trying to restore, especially those, like the ones that have a market value, of course, but also the ones that currently do not have one, but that they are demanded by the society. So I would say that that would be my answer. And of course also the issue with the conflicting goals, and that it is important to have a good national planning to see what is restored where, what type of restoration for which challenge, and try to minimize the trade-offs.
Thank you very much. I have a kind of a follow-up question on that, which links to what you showed in the presentation, Maitane, kind of the things, the priorities that were set in the past and that actually led to the degradation of the land. And also what you mentioned, Katharina, in your presentation, that the stories of the things that did not work out are not often enough told. So I wonder what potential you see in the future, also based on both of your work, to also tell more stories around what did not work and what we can learn, because we often always talk about the kind of the good practices, but of course some of those good practices might not, or might have to be quite adapted because of climate change, because we cannot restore the forest to a former state, but need to kind of focus also on the climate change adaptation component. But then when we maybe we have to look more at what did not work in the past and kind of base our strategies on that. What is your perspective on that? How can, based on your work, how can that be integrated into, for instance, the national strategies to implement the NRR, or just for the practitioners in this call, how can this help them?
All right. Maitane, do you want to go first? Or any thoughts on it? The problem with these lessons learned from the past is that you know it after you have done the mistake, right? So I guess many of the approaches which seemed so good and so cool now might have some limitations in future, but I think we got much better in just addressing limitations and giving them some space and some room so that we know how to deal and how to assess restoration success. Yeah.
So looking more at a definition, what is success?
Maybe, yes.
and adapt the kind of strategies to that.
Yeah, but clearly, I mean, to grow, I think a practitioner in one workshop said something very, very nice, and it's like I don't know exactly how, but it's like focusing on the bigger picture and focusing on the benefits a restoration initiative has for everyone, made it more approachable. So here again, I think communication and knowledge transfer and site visits and so on are super important, and the transnational exchange. So a practitioner in Hungary would love to know what a colleague in Serbia and Austria and so on does with the same ecosystem type, for example. So I think this is something that we need to, for now, there is not enough. I mean, those workshops were a big start, but still, I think here we need more, especially for the implementation of the nature restoration regulation, we need much more initiatives that allow us at the practitioners level to exchange and to learn from each other. Because also like how we deal with different indicators and which measures are implemented for which forest type, I think here we need more, more cooperations.
Thank you very much also for kind of emphasizing the importance of the practitioners exchange, because that is something that is often lacking also in project funding. So we kind of need those living labs, but we also need exchange between different living labs across Europe, between the different practitioners to also learn from the kind of experiences in the past, and to look at different biogeographic regions and their specific challenges, and to see others are facing similar issues and we're not alone. Maitane, do you have something to complement? And then I will still tackle the question of agroforestry, which was in the chat.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to say something similar, that it's really easy to see what didn't work when you look back in time. And I think people are less willing to also say what didn't work in the present. So that's the value of actually having these historical studies. And in the present, I think the way to overcome this is to try to have groups as multidisciplinary and multisectoral as possible, because sometimes I find that some of the mistakes or that we make is actually because we did not work to somebody who could have given us a complementary view of, if I say I'm planning to do this, maybe somebody from a different sector would clearly see, well, this will lead you to this mistake. But because usually we work in our own
Bubbles.
little, yeah, that could be avoided by actually having more, multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral, holistic teams making decisions, I think.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great experiences in Superb, definitely. Okay, so there was only one question in the chat. I think the reason why there are so few questions is also because the presentations were so comprehensive. So we will definitely share them also much broader through different projects we're involved with, because the knowledge is very, very relevant for diverse people we work with. However, I know you're both not you're both not agroforestry experts, but I do agree that agroforestry is something that is very rarely mentioned, and that has this potential to also bring in the economic benefits for the forest owners, and to kind of because one of the issues that you mentioned quite often was the kind of bridging the ecological and economical functions of the forest, and making it beneficial also for the forest owners to restore the land, or to even consider further ecosystem services in a more broader sense, and maybe to also establish some payments for that. But we won't go into deeper into this in this session, but we might pick it up in another forest restoration talk. But what do you think about kind of the potential of agroforestry in terms of also forest restoration, to add another kind of value to the forest, and to also find better agreements with the agricultural sector that you also mentioned was a kind of critical issue when it comes to land management, etc. Maitane, I think the question came up when you were presenting, so.
Yeah, I think you're right, Geshe. I think it has a lot of potential, and it's actually undervalued or understudied when we are talking about restoration. I think it would be a good integrative approach where you actually are tackling different challenges at once, like the lack of funding, the conflicting goals. So in that sense, I think it has a lot of value. But I also think that is not the silver bullet.
No.
So it's, again, I think it's important to have this wider vision of what we do where, with a good, well thought, centralized or planning. And this is an important and very useful tool that can be applied in some situations. But yeah, I think that would be my answer.
Yeah, thank you very much. Definitely the participants, including myself, learned today that there is no silver bullet when it comes to forest restoration, that we can that we need to look at it from different disciplinary perspective, and that we need to look at it from the perspective also of different needs or kind of expectations towards the forest, so the different ecosystem services and different priorities also in different countries. And then finally, of course, because you both work with the practitioners to take the practitioners' perspective very serious and their needs very serious, because they are the ones who ultimately implement the work. And very often they're the ones who also cover for that financially, because they are also the forest owners. So that cannot be emphasized enough. I think that is one of the also crucial outcomes of the Superb project, because so far often people looked at the forest restoration from a scientific perspective and did scientific assessment, but in superb. We really try to bring this together and make it useful for different audiences, and just for the listeners to know that we are also working on preparing all this knowledge in a what we call Forest Knowledge Gateway, in a user-targeted, user-friendly way. So short and precise, with links to several initiatives, learnings, etc. So this is coming in the next couple of months, so stay tuned for that. I want to thank the two presenters, Maitane and Katharina. You had amazing presentation, also very illustrating and very nice visuals, which I, as a communication expert, appreciate a lot. Also, thank you for the stories that you shared. And now I would like to, okay, there is actually now a question. Okay, we have a final question from Johanna in the audience. So maybe you still want to ask it live, or I just ask it for you. So let me see. There she is. Johanna, you can ask the question live and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, there you go.
Perfect. I didn't know what to say in this format, whether I can say anything or whether it's just the speakers.
No, you're live.
No, it was just a remark on your restoration, on your question on the restoration regulation. And I felt also it was quite important to see that, I mean, as we know that challenges are increasing with climate change and droughts and fires and everything that's going to happen in the next decades. Of course, the restoration regulation requires kind of an improvement of so many indicators of forest biodiversity. And so challenge is definitely to see whether success is like defined differently. Just because it's not increasing doesn't mean that the restoration wasn't still successful, because if challenges increase, it could be, you don't know how it would have been if there wasn't impacts like climate change. So it's actually even harder to measure success in this context with very simple indicators. Just to say, it could be just a curve that goes less steep down and it's already a success in the restoration, but it requires actually an improvement of most of the indicators in forest biodiversity. That could be difficult for the nations, for the countries to achieve, and could be demotivating also, because you're doing stuff and you're restoring and putting a lot of effort in it, and still you don't get the indicators up.
Yes, in many cases it will be to kind of prevent further damage or prevent further degradation, and that is already a success then. So we also might have to adapt the kind of indicators, maybe not call them success indicators.
Definition of success.
Exactly, the definition of success would have to be adapted, or they would have to be changed to kind of reduction of degradation indicators or whatever. So yeah, thank you very much for this remark, Johanna, and it was quite complementary to what we discussed before. So that was great. And thank you also for your amazing work on the project. So, okay, then I would like to announce the upcoming webinar in May, which will look at forest restoration from yet another perspective, taking the stakeholder perspectives even more into account than it was done by Maitane and Katharina, or different stakeholders, because we will have discussions on the public perceptions on forests, also not just on forests, but also, of course, on forest restoration, and also the public support for forest restoration in Europe, which was investigated in Superb's work package 5 on policy and public perceptions. And they have done very comprehensive surveys with a lot of people in several European countries, and the results for those countries will be presented in the next session. So you can learn a lot about how people in Sweden, in Germany, and in Spain, for instance, perceive forest, what their expectations towards forests are. So while we learned a lot about the practitioners today, we will learn a lot about the people, the general people, your neighbor, and the owner of the restaurant on the street, what they think about forests and what they think is important and what they prefer in terms of forest restoration. And what was already mentioned by Maitane is that, of course, and also by Katharina, is that the public support and the stakeholder engagement is a crucial success factor for the future restoration activities. So we will learn more about that in the next session. Thank you very much for attending, and I wish you a nice rest of the day. And as said, we will provide the webinar also online via YouTube. Have a nice evening, and we will catch up latest in May.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.